This is my third and final video on disability and neurosis, and I'm going to discuss what it takes to qualify for disability with a mental illness for Social Security, and what sort of evidence of mental illness does Social Security look for, and a type of evidence that I think is underutilized by people applying for disability, both physical and mental. Hello, I'm John Foster. I'm a medical doctor who does Social Security disability exams, and as usual, everything I say reflects my own opinions based on my own experience and study, and not the opinions of the Social Security Administration or any other medical body. Now, just like with physical illness, there are basically two ways to qualify for disability with a mental health problem. The first is to do what's called meet a listing, which is meet the requirements in Social Security's listing of impairment for a mental health disability. Listings are quite strict, and the condition has to be very severe, but that's how you qualify if you have one problem alone. The second way to qualify is to have two or more problems, neither of which would meet a listing, but taken together, Social Security will determine that the person is impaired enough that they're disabled. An example might be somebody who has a moderate stroke, and is quite common in stroke patients. They become depressed due to the stroke. And neither the impairment from the stroke or the depression may be enough to meet a listing, but putting the two together, Social Security may make a determination that the person's work-related abilities are impaired enough that they consider them disabled. The second thing I have to say is, as I've stated before, mental illness means persistent methods of thinking, feeling, and acting that make the person's life worse. And therefore, severe mental illness tends to make the person's life very bad. And when I describe these criteria, I'm not encouraging or suggesting that anybody should have these problems. I certainly hope they don't. I'm simply stating what sort of problems Social Security considers disabling. Now, the first thing to know is that for a mental health disability, Social Security requires that it be persistent. And to qualify, there has to be, at a minimum, a 2-year history of the mental illness. So just as with physical problems, it's important that you see the doctor as regularly as you can, and that at each visit you have documentation that your mental illness is persisting. The second thing is, just like with physical illness, Social Security likes to have specialists' opinion, which for mental illness means an opinion by a psychiatrist or psychologist, preferably on an ongoing basis, but if that's not possible, at least one psychiatrist's or psychologist's opinion will be helpful. Again, just like physical illness, it's not the diagnosis that's important. It's how the problem impairs your work-related abilities. And when it comes to mental disorders, Social Security divides work-related abilities into 4 groups. The first is the ability to understand, remember, and apply information. So if you have trouble understanding or remembering or thinking, that's going to be significant. The second is the ability to interact with others. Can you interact with coworkers, with bosses, with clients or customers, including difficult clients or customers? The third is, can you concentrate, persist, or maintain pace? Does your mind tend to wander, or can you focus and stay on task? And the fourth ability is the ability to adapt or manage yourself. Some people with severe depression have trouble just getting out of bed or getting dressed in the morning, and that's part of managing yourself. Adapting could be, if your job requirements change, can you shift from one position to another? Could you cover for a co-worker who's out of work or ill? Now, to meet a listing, you have to have severe limitation of one of those groups, which means you almost cannot do it at all. Or you have to have marked limitation of two of them, which means that two of those groups you have quite significant difficulty, but not to the extent where you can barely function. Things that may help to demonstrate that your mental illness is significant are, first of all, are you on psychiatric medication? And from what I hear from the Social Security disability attorneys, being prescribed an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication by your family doctor alone probably won't qualify you. On the other hand, if you've been tried on several different medications by a psychiatrist, and there's evidence that your condition persists despite the medication, that would be valuable evidence of a significant mental illness. The next is, have you had a mental illness hospitalization? Have you been admitted to a psychiatric ward or psychiatric facility or detox facility? The third, which is kind of unfortunate, is there a history of suicide attempts? I'm going to include the telephone number for the suicide hotline in the description to this video below, but if you have a history of suicide attempts, you definitely want to disclose that to Social Security. Also, have you required crisis counseling in the past? Now, I'm going to talk about a type of documentation which I rarely see, which I think is particularly helpful in the case of mental illness, but can also be helpful in certain physical illnesses as well. And this is what Social Security calls non-medical source statements, which are statements by people who are not doctors or nurses or hospital records describing the problems and the effects of those problems that they have seen. Now, you can either give the name and address and phone number of these people to Social Security and they will contact them with your permission. But what I think is most helpful is if you can get a written statement from these folks describing your problems and what they've seen. And this can include family members, caregivers, friends, neighbors, clergy, employers, teachers, case managers, social workers, shelter staff, community support or outreach workers, and school or vocational training personnel. If, for example, you've gone to a priest or minister for counseling for your mental problems, if they would consent to write a letter describing what they've seen and how they've seen you affected, you can include that in your application for Social Security disability. Same thing for an employer or family member or neighbor or friend. I really think that in cases of mental illness, this can be very valuable information. The final thing that I think people don't think about enough, any side effects that you have from prescribed psychiatric medication that impair your ability to work are important to mention. Common side effects of psychiatric medication include drowsiness, forgetfulness, emotional blunting, and some psychiatric medications cause problems with movement, either abnormal movements or impaired ability to move. Be sure to include any side effects of the medication that you're taking to help with your psychiatric condition. Well, I hope this has been helpful, and as always, remember, if it happens, it's possible.